Hello and welcome to the Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. I'm Maria Armoudian. Why have so many human rights campaigns failed in China? Why have others fared better? How have these campaigns affected political movements? And how can activism work in an authoritarian country? Stephen Noakes is joining us. He's a senior lecturer at the University of Auckland and the author of The Advocacy Trap, Transnational Activism and State Power in China. Welcome to the Scholar Circle, Stephen Noakes. It's great to have you here talking about your new book, The Advocacy Trap. Perhaps the title is the place to start. Why is it a trap?
Well, I call it The Advocacy Trap because most of the international actors, NGOs, foundations, and so forth that initially flowed into China thought that they were going to change China from the outside in. And what has happened more often than not, actually, is that the reverse is true. They themselves wound up in a position where their mission and message was actually shaped through their engagement with China's government.
That's totally fascinating. The way you approached the book is you sort of contextualized it within this context of international NGOs and human rights groups that other scholars have studied about how they do manage to change things through this interconnectedness. You sort of debunked that works all the time.
Yeah, I mean, engagement was supposed to be an alternative to isolation. Isolation had not worked. For example, the United States had attempted to do this with Cuba, an embargo that was supposed to bring the Castro regime to its knees, and then 50 years later was still in place and simply had to be abandoned for lack of desired effect. Engagement, on the other hand, was supposed to be about bringing non-democratic regimes like China into the global conversation. Let's make them play by the same global trading rules as everyone else. Who knows, maybe we can socialize these countries to liberal values in one way or another. Seems that that's not the case either.
Right. Now, the previous scholars who had looked at NGO advocacy, what do you think it was that they missed?
There was a time when NGOs in the study of international politics were supposed to be the tip of the spear at a time when states, governments, as traditionally defined, were in decline. This is the immediate post-Cold War era, and scholars were writing very openly about the declining relevance of states, about the obsolescence of states in both real and conceptual terms. What was replacing those states and that international system of states was a global civil society, they said. This was what globalization was about, a borderless world. It turns out borders and states actually matter quite a bit. I, of course, have the benefit of hindsight. It's been 25, 30 years now since a lot of these writings came out. But governments matter an enormous amount. State policies matter an enormous amount for the crafting of the mission and message of advocacy networks and NGOs.
Right. So the idea of it just being civil society mattering and being interconnected, I mean, it seems like states matter, but economic connections matter more. They
may do. And there are elements of economics at play in all of the groups that I've studied for this book, each of the 6 different advocacy networks. Other things may matter just as much. For example, personal connections. Knowing someone on the inside is often 3/4 of the battle. But we can't sit here and pretend that material interests aren't at play, even in those groups which might not necessarily advertise that that's how they work.
So I suppose somebody could say that what you're guilty of is something that you actually said in the book. You said we have to now look at the unromantic and often uncomfortable realities. Maybe you're guilty of saying to the optimists, let's get real.
I think that's right in some sense. I see the book as a bit of a bucket of cold water on that excessively rosy picture of transnational civil society, of global civil society that we had back in the mid to late 90s. When I say uncomfortable and unromantic, what I'm really asking that community of practitioners is, how willing are you to get your hands dirty? Just how dirty? What would you sacrifice to get just an inch of what you want actually done?
And you talked about some of the changes that these organizations that maybe wanted to be pure but had to sort of shift. You said it was kind of like mission creep, but it was a sort of a compromised position they had to go into even to see an ounce of change.
I call it advocacy drift. The allusion to mission creep works, but only up to a certain point. Mission creep is actually about the administrative bloat, that fattening up of institutions that happens through bureaucratization over time. Advocacy drift can be actually just the opposite. What it refers to is a scaling back, in some instances a complete reversal of the principled core that actually defines an international NGO or movement. So, for example, one of the examples I talk about in the book is the Tibetan independence movement. For 60 years, it was driven and bound by this commitment to the idea that there ought to be a free and independent Tibet. That is no longer the core idea, the core mission. What exactly happened here? Well, I think it was 60 years of banging one's head against the wall. It was very clear that China's government was never in a million years going to go for that. So there had to be this strategic tailoring of the central objective in a manner that was palatable to those who actually comprised that movement. And
so if you were going to describe what that achieved, what would you say that is?
In that particular case, I don't think it's clear yet. I do couch that at the end of the book and say I don't think the story is finished. Normally what I would say, at least in the context of the Tibetan independence movement, is that with the head cut off, the body will die. And so what will happen as one Dalai Lama passes away and another takes his place, what will that mean for the coherence of the movement? If I was to make a prediction, I would say the movement as we now know it is not likely to be in a few years' time.
And that's largely because China's government just refused to play in the ways that they wanted them to.
That's right. I mean, it's almost never the case that foreign activists succeed in convincing China to change its mind, to change its policies on a given issue. It's incredibly rare that China's government adopts a position for reasons other than something it didn't already favor anyway for its own purposes. And so that can actually create a great deal of confusion when we actually attribute certain effects to advocacy networks. It can look like they are having some kind of meaningful impact when in reality it's just a coincidence.
How would you compare the Tibetan case with, say, the Falun Gong case?
Well, they both fall under what I would generally term human rights, and both have achieved exactly nothing, no aspect of their original mission and message. What actually differentiates the one from the other is that the Falun Gong case does not exemplify advocacy drift. It has shown much greater commitment to its core principle, despite the fact that it really doesn't have any credible hope of succeeding. I don't think that necessarily means that Falun Gong practitioners are more ideologically pure, and the goal of the book isn't to criticize the sincerity of everyone's convictions, but what I do say is that their incentives may be different. When there's nothing but the fall left, how one takes the fall might matter a great deal. And I think that that's exactly what Falun Gong practitioners are thinking when they remain committed to this objective when the odds are so strongly stacked against them. The same might not be true for the Free Tibet movement.
So if we were to look at the campaigns that did succeed, and you listed some of them in your book, they were quite different. Their mission was different. Their approach was different. What were those?
The first and most obviously successful instance was the campaign to improve China's intellectual property rights regime for exactly the reason you might think of. It has everything to do with keeping China attractive as a place to invest by convincing foreign investors that their proprietary technology is going to be safe and not ripped off, and that brand integrity actually means something, the Chinese government actually does itself a solid. It gets to continue to improve the lot of the middle class, general growth in the country's wealth and its redistribution as well. There are other more successful examples. For the one that comes immediately to mind is the Greenpeace campaign, which was initially aimed at getting China to adopt a cap and trade, a firm cap on its carbon emissions. It exemplified advocacy drift in the sense that China rejected that cap and trade scheme, believing probably pretty accurately that it would be bad for growth. It actually was worth it in the context of this Greenpeace campaign to amend the central goal. What they actually said was, maybe it doesn't matter so much how China's carbon outputs are reduced, as long as they get reduced. And so they and others within this transnational campaign took to partnering more actively with state agencies and government actors in order to see that new targets were set.
Do you think that in some cases it's not quite drift as much as it's strategic overshooting? And with the idea that, yes, we'll compromise at some point?
That might be true. I can't actually think of a concrete example where I know that a sort of false target, a high bar was set, knowing very well it was unachievable, but so that any impact that came in below that bar seemed phenomenal nevertheless, given the impossible-looking odds. What I say in the book is that I think there's something at the core of these advocacy networks where these groups can face a real conflict of interest. At what point does pragmatism actually undermine principle? I don't know that there's a clear or consistent answer to that question, but what I wanted to do here is call attention to that issue, which the international relations and political science literature I'm addressing has really not done a great job of.
So you would think that in the case of the environment and in the case of the intellectual property, where China did change, it did address the goal of the advocacy group, but they did it really more for their own advantage?
That's right.
Would you say that's right?
Yeah. What I develop in the latter chapters is what I call a domestic legitimacy-based explanation. Legitimacy simply means the right to rule. How does this government retain its moral authority? How does it retain the consent of those it governs over? And when you look at this question of the impact of advocacy networks through this prism of legitimacy, the decisions that the Chinese government makes actually make a lot more sense. It can, for example, ignore the claims of Falun Gong practitioners and Free Tibet activists because those things are largely not important for its domestic legitimacy. On the other hand, it has to address issues that affect economic productivity or the cleanliness of the air, its fitness to be breathed by people. Those are the kinds of issues that, if not properly addressed, will affect the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy and its ability to govern.
So it's really largely about power and maintaining power. That's
exactly it. It's a study in authoritarian resilience.
There were two other cases that come to mind. One was dealing with the AIDS and HIV treatment, and the other was about trying to abolish the death penalty. What happened in those cases?
I refer to these jointly as instances of intercessory advocacy. In the HIV/AIDS case, it was scholars and scientists and medical experts who were actually shrewd enough to recognize a moment when it presented itself, to see an opportunity to influence the about face that China was itself making. For many years, China's response to the HIV/AIDS crisis, which was clustered in the southwest of the country, was ideologically driven. The sense was that because this was a disease of intravenous drug users and sex workers, they got what they deserved. These were depraved people who deserved to die. Exactly. There were other much more pointed statements that the Chinese leadership made in the early 1980s that HIV/AIDS was symptomatic of sick capitalist societies. It wasn't until quite a while later when the disease actually threatened to undermine the party's own legitimacy in action in addressing a public health crisis, for example, that there came a moment when UN scientists and sympathetic others from around the world were able to say, you know what, we think we could present information to China's government in such a way that they will find palatable. They spoke the ostensibly value-neutral language of science and said, here's our data, here's what we think you can do to address this problem. And that, for China's government, was a win-win. They got to address the concerns of the Chinese public and show themselves to be accountable, responsible, able to deal with emerging health crises. The case of the death penalty abolition campaign is somewhat different. This is one of those instances where attributing a causal effect to the international campaign is, I believe, a mistake. There have been vast reductions in the numbers of the executed in China in recent times. We are not in a position to say exactly what those numbers are because technically the number of death sentences carried out each year remains a state secret. However, the best available information, which comes from Amnesty International, says that it's roughly half what it was a decade ago. One might be tempted, therefore, to assume that international pressure, international scrutiny has had something to do with it. It's actually not the case at all. Beginning in 2007, a new policy was introduced known in English as kill fewer, kill carefully. The idea was to retain the death penalty for the most serious offenders while actually making it more institutionalized, more juridical. In this way, China's Communist Party got to appear both tough on crime when circumstances warranted and increasingly law-bound, right? It was about demonstrating a commitment to stability and order, but also a commitment to the rule of law. These are announced and well-known priorities for China's Communist Party. So again, it scores a victory, but it's not clear that international activists really had anything to do with it at all.
So it seems like one of the arguments in your book is that there can be, if framed properly and if focused properly, changes in particular policies in an incremental way in a country like China, an authoritarian country, but don't expect anything major.
That's right. I mean, it's really about redrawing what we mean by success, reconceptualizing success, and understanding that in the extremely unlikely situation that an international group succeeds in getting China to change its mind, these are really baby steps that are being taken. You cannot expect major changes overnight, and if those changes were to occur, it's probably not because of something an NGO did.
And it's largely also, one of the journalists I interviewed before for a book was using the sentence of those with the guns make the laws. And it sounds like what you're saying is those with the power will say yes or no, and they don't really, it doesn't matter what the rest of us say.
That's mostly true. You know, that original framing of powerful transnational civil societies versus increasingly inconsequential, obsolete states, I don't think that there's necessarily a ton of truth to that. That original puzzle in the research was presented as one of the soft power of advocacy networks triumphing over the hard power of states. Why should that be? After all, states have tanks and armies and guns, whereas international advocates have to make do with beauty and truth. Well, the tanks, the guns, the armies, the hard power actually does prevail most of the time.
Yeah, so you don't see an Arab revolution happening in China?
No, I do not. Were it to occur, it would be unrelated to international pressure.
And so in the end, you're saying, well, maybe we have to think through what is achievable. You said good governance, for example, but is that really the enemy of, say, human rights and democracy? Or is it just, look, we can get this done, maybe we should?
When I mention good governance, no, it's not necessarily the enemy of human rights and democracy. I mean, in this part of the world, Aotearoa, we know democracy and good governance to be two sides of the same coin. I just mean that China's taking baby steps. It is a better governed country, substantially better governed than it was 40 years ago, for example. It's just extremely unlikely that outsiders, foreigners somehow are going to be able to promote larger changes. Those sorts of
Unless
things have to come
there's an
from
economic reason for it.
It's substantially more likely to come from within because of this focus that the party has. Some might say obsession with domestic legitimacy. The loss of that will mean big things for the Communist Party and the ability of the regime to survive. But at the moment, the best available information tells us that the Communist Party actually enjoys rather high popular legitimacy. There is not the widespread opposition to its rule that so many imagine that there is. And this means that certain things like Falun Gong and the Free Tibet movement actually are not terribly important and can just be shunted aside with no political cost. Other things that's not necessarily true of. There would be a reckoning for a party that did not take responsibility for a major public health crisis or failed to deliver a public good like drinkable water, clean air, something like that.
It's fascinating. You know, a couple of the other things you mentioned that sometimes they use the frame, for example, in the AIDS crisis of, oh, this is just, ugly, dirty capitalism rearing its ugly head. But isn't China, in fact, a capitalist country?
That rhetoric is very old now. They tend not to talk like that anymore. But it was incredibly common back in the mid-'70s. China's new rulers. Until
they became capitalists
themselves. That's right. It was really not until after 76 when the second generation of leadership came to power and there was a more market-oriented model of socialism for China. The term socialism with Chinese characteristics covers all sins, right? I think it's fancy talk for reinventing the rules, making them up as we go along. The official slogan given to this is crossing the river by feeling the stones. Practice is the sole criterion for determining truth. It means we're making it up as we go along, but you can't simply back away from all that old-time socialist rhetoric. It would mean telling a country of 1 1/3 billion people that they had been lied to. What you have to do is tweak what Chinese socialism actually means, continue to reinvent the party's own mission and message in accordance with social expectations and demands. That is how China's Communist Party can actually survive when so many other strong communist states didn't 25, 30 years ago.
Well, part of that is that it's not really communist.
It helps that people are able to afford a little more.
So they use the term Communist Party, but it's not communist really at all.
It looks different to us from the outside.
It certainly wasn't the communism that Marx talked about.
It's incredibly different from that. It's not an old-time Leninist state. But equally, some of those old-time institutions have not faded away nearly as quickly as you might have thought. There are distinct socialist mentalities that remain, one of which is an intense distrust for civil society actors, whether those are domestic or foreign. You would think that along with market reforms and opening up, that there would be greater space for transnational civil society, for domestic civil society. It's not true. If anything, it's gotten much tighter. And China comes by this stance quite honestly, given its origins of Leninist stock and its not so great interactions with foreigners in recent history.
And when you talk about this tweaking that it's been doing, is that how you would contextualize the most recent governance advances of expanding the presidency into additional terms? Is that just tweaking, or is that something else?
I think that's a little bigger now. I understood the recent proposed constitutional changes as mostly an undoing of the informal mechanisms that the second, third, and fourth generations of party leadership had put in place. It seemed since the late 1980s that what was emerging in China was a groupthink model, a form of collegial rule in which certain informal institutions mattered a great deal and were important for ensuring the survival of the party at moments of political transition and leadership succession. So one of these was mandatory retirement. Another was a formal cap on the term limits of the presidency. Now it seems that these things are actually not as important when you can have one leader with a great deal of power concentrated around them simply move those principles to the side when it suits them.
And so ultimately, what do you think it will mean for China and for the rest of us?
I don't think you're likely to see big changes in China for quite some time. And when I say big changes, I mean regime change. It's probably time to stop talking about a liberal democratic China. I'd only add parenthetically that China considers itself a paragon democracy. In fact, the Chinese indigenous understanding is that it is a more genuine democracy than is the United States. Why? Because instead of having someone sit down and write the Constitution and create institutions that then shape and guide the behavior of ordinary citizens, the Chinese system is one that attempts to build the institutions out of the culture, right? In that sense, the domestic argument in China is that it's actually more authentically democratic because it's more attuned to what people actually want.
So the final thing in terms of China in the world that I just wanted to ask you about that is less tuned into the advocacy trap, but more just as you as a China scholar, is the move to militarize some of the islands in the South Pacific. What do you think that has in store?
You asked me a moment ago about the impact for the rest of us. It certainly matters a great deal to New Zealand because it retains a certain caretaker role in conducting the foreign and any military affairs associated with these island countries. The most recent example of the thing you're talking about was the report that came out yesterday that China had been in discussions with Vanuatu over some sort of permanent military installation there. I think it just means that the balance of power in the region is slowly but palpably shifting, and that there is now an emerging tug of war between traditional aid powers, traditional superpowers, by which I mean the US, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth, and newcomers like China. Were I in a position to be speaking to Jacinda Ardern here and now, I think I would say, pay attention, Madam Prime Minister, to the message of the advocacy trap. Ask yourself those hard questions. Exactly what are your principles? How committed to them are you? How dirty are you willing to get your hands? Would you walk away from some of the trade commitments that New Zealand has made? Would you keep those commitments by shutting up when it's in the interest of shutting up?
Tough questions.
Yeah, it's really about searching one's soul, because it's almost surely not the case that by bringing China closer to us in New Zealand, to Pacific Island societies, that China is going to be the one that's changed.
Fascinating. Well, Stephen Noakes, the book is called The Advocacy Trap, senior lecturer here at the University of Auckland. It's a great pleasure to host you. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.